Yeah, so I mean, I proposed the motion, so to speak, uh, that trans women are not women. I can either go ahead and define that and lay down the notion, or do you want to start with the defense?
You can go ahead and start. That's fine.
Yeah. Okay. Well, my case is pretty simple. Women are adult human females. We're adult members of the female sex in the human species. And that means only the female sex. Not people who think they're female, not people who undergo cosmetic surgeries to look like they're females, just people who are female. So that's pretty much the basis on which for me this debate stands, because unlike apparently most people, I didn't go through a process where I went to the other side and then came back. The first time I heard this, it didn't make sense to me. Male to female trans people are not women.
Okay.
Trans female people who claim to be trans are still women, whether they like it or not. So on that basis,
I'm sorry, I just didn't hear your last statement. Could you just repeat it?
Female people who also are trans-identified, as long as they're adults, adult female people who claim to be trans are also women, irrespective of what other term they may use to describe themselves. And male to female trans people are not. It's that simple. Women are adult human females. We're the adult members of the female sex of the human species. And so far, I have not found a single convincing argument to tell me why this should be otherwise. And hence, the inference of that is that trans women, as trans women, the term in popular usage actually does refer to male to female trans people, are not women.
Okay.
Okay. So, yeah, your turn.
So the perspective that I come about this is that, of course, sex exists. No one is denying it. Well, neither one of us are going to deny that sex is a social or claim that sex is a social construct.
Okay.
However, what defines what is or is not a woman, or what is not a man, is, generally speaking, from my perspective, more along the lines of a social condition and how society or groups of people treat said members of that class. Class being not being here, in my estimation, just a word that I'm using in order to define the group here. It's not a Marxist perspective or anything like that. And as such, what largely embodies what is man or woman is, generally speaking, the outward look and how people view that outward look to the person. If a person is being if a person is or is not passing, that is not material to me about this definition, because what they are attempting to do is integrate themselves into that class of people, and therefore should be treated as such for a common respect. Whether or not I'm sure we'll get into debates about whether or not women are primarily oppressed for reasons of sex and controlling birth. I'm sure we'll get into stuff like that. But as far as day-to-day interactions, it is what a person looks like is how they are going to be treated. And act. Of course, how a person acts is going to also influence how they're treated, but our initial response reactions to people is based on visual and audio cues, not necessarily how somebody might think or would do something, because that initial presence is what we initially react to.
Okay. So in your argument, you are proceeding on the basis, firstly, that what can be said to be a man or woman is according to me. Now, right there we have a problem, because when you start from a point where you get to say, according to me, X is something, and you do not have a common understanding of it, and you do not also follow what has been the common understanding of it throughout history, you're essentially saying nothing means anything. So today, according to that argument, I can say that, in fact, I'm not sitting down. maybe according to me, this is a half-standing posture. So, firstly, an individual, any individual, getting to decide, right?
I'm sorry, water went down the wrong pipe.
It's fine. It's fine. The mere starting point where you start to say, well, according to me, that itself is something that is hugely problematic. And for someone coming from the global south, it is an exercise of a very particular viewpoint where individuals think they get to define reality. Reality doesn't care what we think. What reality cares about, we use words to describe a certain reality because we are an advanced species and we use language to communicate. The word describes a fact of existence. It is not up to you or me to decide what reality is, and it is even less up to you and me in a society to say that for me this means something, especially if it conflicts with common shared understandings of the same. Right. So, firstly, with that approach, the fact that according to me what it means, I don't care what it means according to me. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter to me, and it is irrelevant what I think it is. What matters is what it is. Okay? And so that was your first point, that according to you. Secondly,
if I could just correct, just to make sure that we're both on the same page here. I'm talking primarily about what society deems is or is not a woman or a person, a member of a particular class. The individual of themselves determining that is less of an issue to me than whether or not society accepts it.
Okay, so
for this debate,
right. So I'll get to that. Secondly, what makes a man or a woman? Again, this assumes a reversal of the perspectives where society gets to determine what is. No, there are some things that society gets to determine. Society gets to determine what currency is. We get to determine the value of the euro or the dollar, and even that is largely beyond our control. But there is a world, and most parts of the world, and most aspects of our existence, that is not beyond our control, and we describe it. We live with it, we manage it, but the first step to living with it is describing it. So no, society is not deciding what a man or woman is. Society has never decided that. Society has observed what existed in nature and has sought to describe it in terms that make our life more manageable and more administratively convenient. When you have an intellectual worldview that says, well, society gets to, when you talk about what society thinks is a man or woman, society doesn't get to decide that. Society doesn't decide that I'm a human being. Society has no freaking choice. I was born as a Homo sapien. Okay? Now, if we actually were able to crossbreed, and if I was born with furry legs and a tail, I won't be a Homo sapien. Okay? That's like saying society gets to decide what is a human being. Society doesn't. How is that different? Okay, so that was one thing. Secondly, in your first rebuttal, you talked about, okay, well, how society classes us is primarily based on audio-visual cues. So we're really going to proceed on the basis that audio-visual cues are what make us, or is that just relevant as far as perception goes? Because today I could wear a white coat, okay, or scrubs, and I could step out onto the street and people might think I'm a doctor. That does not make me a doctor. In fact, in the COVID protests in the US, there were allegations that the two nurses who stood on the street taking on the protesters were not in fact nurses, that they were just wearing scrubs. So does anyone who looked like a doctor become a doctor? Because your audio-visual cue there, the initial reports of that story said they were in fact nurses, right?
Well, I think... So, go ahead, sorry, you're not done, my bad.
Yeah, almost done. So firstly, visual cues, while temporarily and momentarily useful,
It's okay.
Temporarily and momentarily useful to determine what you think a person might be or a thing might be, is not determinative of what it is. Okay? It's exactly like the question you asked me at the beginning of this conversation, because if people haven't seen me, if they've just heard me, A lot of people assume I'm American. They assume I'm British. I'm neither of those. Now, if I were to actually hold a British passport, someone elsewhere may still not assume I'm British unless I show my passport. So, does that make me less of a British person? Does that make me less of an Indian? Audiovisual cues are momentary impressions that does not define or is even, it's only relevant for up to 10% of what they are. Can they be perceived as such? Sure. I mean, drag queens are sometimes perceived as women. That doesn't make them women any more than it makes trans women women. I'm done.
Okay. So one of the things I think that we're going to have an issue, not necessarily an issue, but a point of contention is whether or not the count.
Sorry.
With Okay. Whether or not the consequences of how people are perceived defines how reality for those individuals operates. So let me give an example here. A, in the United States, there was an instance of a boyish lesbian being prevented from entering a woman's restroom by a police officer or security guard because they perceived this person to be a man. Whether or not now clearly they weren't a quote unquote man. They were trying to use the restroom of their sex, and because of a law passed within this state, I don't remember exactly where it was, they were prevented from doing so because somebody perceived them as being being trans. So no, they were not trans, right? However, the reaction to this person trying to use that bathroom was deemed to be trans, and so in the moment, society, these individuals deemed that person to be trans. So the consequence of that action was that they were quote unquote trans. The same thing applies to other individuals, and you said humans. Society doesn't get to determine what are humans. History has proven that time and time again to be untrue. So within the United States, as another example, slavery was indemnified based on the belief that the black people were subhuman. I don't believe that, but that's what society believed at the time, and therefore the consequences of that is that the black people in the United States were treated as subhuman. Other places around the world can have done similar things within certain systems. We can talk about whether or not the British looked at the Irish as being fully human, or whether or not the I don't know. I don't know. I'm not going to come up with another example because I think you get the point. So I think that's the kind of contention that we're coming, or not contention, but disconnect we're coming from, because I'm focusing more kind of on the consequences of how society treats these people, rather than whether or not they are quote unquote and is in reality. So that's just that.
Okay. So 2 points. One, there are bad consequences to saying that someone can be a woman, and therefore we cannot define this. That mere argument, again, not just reverses the whole thought process, but if you were to start applying that approach uniformly and saying that because someone can be misperceived, nothing can be defined, or no category should be held.
No,
that is it.
I'm not saying that nothing can be or cannot be defined. I'm saying that what something generally is perceived to be is largely socially determined, and within the here and now. Now we can talk about we could broaden this out and talk about how somebody might not be in totality of what reality actually is, which nobody can actually honestly say that they can perceive. That's why we have philosophy saying "I think, therefore I am," or we have dialectic forms of argument within philosophy in order to determine what is and is not reality, because nobody can be 100% for sure. At least that's one way to look at it. So that is where I'm coming from this, is that our reality is shaped by how society deems that reality to be in the here and now, and I'm not entirely concerned about what in this debate, what is in the sense of universal truth, or whatever, however you want to define it?
I'm not particularly concerned with universal truth either, but I am concerned with objective reality and material reality. Two things. One, if it is about perception, then the slogan should be trans women should be perceived as women, not trans women are women. Because trans women are women is a statement that is a normative statement that is trying to make a claim about is, not what they're perceived as or treated as or should be addressed as. Three very different topics.
Go ahead, sorry.
Three very different topics. What a person is, perceived as, addressed as, or treated as, all for very different conversations. They're not the same. And this kind of conflation is not just dangerous, but is chaotic from a legal point of view, from an administrative point of view, from a policy point of view, and from a safety point of view. Because what is very different from saying, well, they are perceived as such. So going back to your earlier argument about the butch lesbian being treated badly, people who do not fit within certain gender norms have always been treated badly. Mm-hmm. Okay? Gender non-conforming people, that is people who do not fit typical attributes or impressions of what you expect members of a certain cluster might be to be like, have always been treated badly. Yeah. However, that is never a justification and has never been used as justification to therefore say that the members of the class can be redefined or that the class can be redefined because humans react to deviations badly. Let's take another example. Any form of disability, okay? Take people who are limping, blind, deaf, whatever it is. All of them do not conform to society's impression of a regular human in some way. And in most societies in history, they have been treated badly. They have been considered as cursed. They have also been thought of as less human. Mm-hmm. Okay? But that never stops and has never been the source of an argument or the basis to therefore argue that you can define a human being differently. That because blind people are also human, therefore humans are blind. That is not a logical conclusion that you can come to. It is indefensible. Okay?
Well,
secondly...
Okay, sorry, you're not done. Please.
Before I forget about this. The thing about human beings, this is, if I had a nickel for every time I've heard this argument, I'd be so rich by now. That societies didn't recognize people as fully human. Yes, that is true. Societies socially and legally, our systems that we create, didn't recognize them as fully human. And which is why I said so again. It doesn't matter what society does because Black people were human. They were still Homo sapiens. How do we know this? Because even then people interbred and they could have children. People of different species cannot actually have children. Okay, we know they're human. How do we know that despite not giving them legal rights or constitutional rights or social rights that white people consider Black people human? They went abroad and shipped them here to do the work that they knew that their bulls and oxen and dogs couldn't do. They treated them badly, yes, but even at the height of slavery, nobody seriously thought they were of a different species. And again, how do we know this? Because they carried out medical experiments on them. They knew we had the same bodies. They knew we belonged to the same class. Legal systems can be entirely fictional. Legal systems can be made up on the basis of anything. That does not change reality. Society can only observe reality and manage it. Society could not redefine Blacks as not human even then. They can treat them as less human. But they could not redefine it because irrespective of what American society might have said, Black people were still human beings. And this is a massive leap of logic that I am saying across the globe among apparently people of a certain stream of thought. That you think just because people used to treat legal systems and constitutional systems used to treat people badly, yes, and therefore you can't define them as such. They're still human beings. They were always human beings. History tells us they were human beings, irrespective of how white society treats them. So two things. One, the fact that people who are not conforming to certain typical attributes and expectations, therefore get injured or harmed, while an awful consequence does not negate the basis for the definition of the class. And the fact that society may not have included certain people in a class is not evidence of the fact that they did not independently belong to that class, because irrespective of whether society knew something or not, or recognized something or not, it existed. It's like the germ theory. We didn't discover the germ theory until last century. We were still getting sick and dying of germs. Yeah, I'm done.
Okay. One thing that I wanted to comment on is the class aspect of this, because it seems like you are putting women into only those that are the sex of female, whereas I'm saying that gender roles exist, gender norms exist, and people that are trying to fit within those would then be considered within society to be part of the broader class that is the gender of women. So from my perspective, trans women are members of the class of women, no differently than black women are also women, or lesbian women are women, right? So that's the way I am approaching this. One of the things that I'd like to know from you is whether or not you would like to see gender as an idea be gotten rid of.
It doesn't really matter what I'd like to see. I'm not exactly someone who believes in dreams. What I do know is this. In history, we have always, it doesn't really matter what I want to see. Maybe gender can be got rid of, maybe it can't. Maybe it's stereotypes, maybe it can't. We're still learning. A lot of people tend to think that we have all the answers to these questions about human nature and human behavior. We do not. Okay, now what I'd like to say is irrelevant. What I do know is that the male and female sexes, have always had certain expectations attributed to them. I agree. Now, in certain societies, they're called gender roles. In many other societies, where gender as a concept does not exist separately from sex, they're simply called sex roles or sex expectations. What happens if they breach the expectations? What happens if they can't live up to it? That is a problem, yes, and people should obviously not be punished for it. However, they do not cross sex classes. They cannot. It is impossible. And to go back to your earlier point about how you perceive it, what I would like to know is why it's relevant, how certain people or even society perceives it. Because society, now I'm coming to what society's done, has not in the past considered women on the basis of their gender roles. The gender is the secondary step in the thought process. You look at a person manifesting a certain gender expression and you assume they belong to the woman's sex class. However, it was not the other way around, that everyone who looks like a woman is automatically considered in the woman's sex class. How do we know this? Because in the past, when a man who was dressed as a woman and who actually passed convincingly as a woman was to be found in the mistress's quarters or something like that, that would cause an uproar. You can pass, you can fool some people some of the time. That does not mean he's being considered a woman. And that's also why before women were able to study and to work, there are some stories of some women who pretended to be men. They dressed as men. They carried it off quite convincingly. Again, society may have temporarily perceived them as men, but once reality returns and their original identity is discovered, they're recorded as women, and they are women. That reality does not change, irrespective of the fact that in their lifetimes, one of them actually went on to have a very successful career as a doctor. Perception stops when you discover the truth, and perception can only take you so far. The idea that because the notion that society today perceives you as a woman based on your gender expression is false. It's very momentary. The minute they come close to you, or they get to see you, or they ask you for your name, that's when they are confirmed that who they're actually talking to is a woman, a woman, a human being of the female sex, not someone who just looks like a woman. And society doesn't define a woman according to how they look either. It defines a woman as someone who belongs to the female sex class, no one else. So, on what basis is because I perceive it as such an argument? It doesn't matter. And on that basis, on basis of society may sometimes allow you to cross the boards. It may sometimes say, okay, well, I perceive you as a woman, think you're a woman, but remember, when society is treating you like that, there is an underlying assumption in place that they think you're a female. They think you're a female. That's exactly why you are having all of these meltdowns about people in dating, where they discover that, oh no, you're not actually of the sex that they thought you were. Society doesn't define women according to gender roles. Society then limits them according to gender roles.
Well, the whole point of the reason I asked you if whether or not you wanted to see gender get gotten rid of is partly because of that. Whether or not society currently, as a whole, deems that trans women are women is not necessarily material to the debate. It's whether or not they ought to be considered women or not. Right now, we're in a transition period between whether or not society will consider what you claim, which is that women are just female only, or whether or not it's something where people that want to see gender roles gotten rid of, more or less, to be more inclusive, to include trans women, who are people that are trying to fit themselves within the category that is women. As to the point that you made about women that passed as men, I think the consequences of them passing was that they were treated like men the entire time. Whether or not the reality, quote unquote, was that they were women as such, or female as such, wasn't really material until after the fact. And the consequences are more where I am focused on, because if gender roles are gotten rid of, or if they didn't exist within this time frame, then maybe women wouldn't have had to dress us as men, or maybe, I mean, it's possible that they were trans. Maybe they weren't trying to. It's possible. I'm not saying it is. We don't know for sure whether or not that they had to or not. So I would like to see gender roles themselves to be, if not completely gotten rid of, at least be entirely less constricting than they are, especially for various parts of the world where they're, the Middle East, where they are extremely constricting. And I think that the consequences are more where I'm focused at, which is basically, to restate, if you are treated as such at a time as being a member of one of the sex classes, quote unquote, then your reality is, and how everybody else perceives that reality, is that you are. And the reason that we have the whole trans women are women debate is because they are trying, the point is to be inclusive of trans women being women into that role.
Okay, so to go from the top of that, firstly, whether I want to get rid of gender roles or not, whether we can get rid of gender roles or not, doesn't matter to the sex class, because the sex class will continue to exist. Okay?
Right. I'm not debating that the sex class doesn't exist. That's...
You're debating that the sex class doesn't exist?
No, I'm not. I'm saying that It does exist. I think everybody can realize just from basic biology that there is such thing as sex. We have some instances of XXY or YYX, but those are outliers.
Yeah, so firstly, irrespective of what I or any other feminist wants to happen with gender, sex classes are going to exist. Secondly, should trans women be considered women? Again, not up to society, because no matter what you do, you cannot change sex classes. Or as of now, we do not have them. Maybe there will come a time when you can actually rewire your entire body, but you're not there yet. As of now, the maximum sex reassignment surgery only consists of cosmetic changes to your genitalia and some and other appendages. Thirdly, so again, the idea that society can decide whether they can get into this category is as fantastical as saying that society can decide whether bonobos will be included into the class of human beings.
Did you say bonobos? I didn't hear you.
Yeah,
There's
bonobos.
Some feedback. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
No, that's fine.
So that assertion that it is up to society to decide, or that we can make an argument for society to consider, that is as fantastical. Bonobos are not Homo sapiens. No matter what you do, again, I mean, I'm sure we can find a mad scientist who's trying to create a human being from a bonobo. They are not human beings. So what society wants to do, fine, but they will not be women. Now, the only way you can do that is by changing the word to describe the female sex class, women. Now, if you redefine the word woman to mean gender, or rather someone who's perceived as a woman, then maybe you can make that argument. But again, then you would just need a different word to describe the female sex class in human beings that does exist, because we are going to exist. So how do you describe us then? So now, yeah, we use the word female across all species.
I know, across species, I understand.
Yeah, because and the words women, girl, and the corresponding words in literally most languages in existence describe the human beings. So even if you were to redefine the word woman against our will, in order to include anybody who you might consider as trans women now, you still can't do that, because your definition is circular. You're still stuck with saying a woman is someone who either, I've gotten these options, who either identifies as a woman, is treated as a woman, considers herself a woman, is perceived as a woman. You do realize that definitions don't work like that, right? Definitions need elements that are independently defined. You cannot define woman as someone who is perceived as a woman. The definition collapses.
You can, but you're right in saying that we would have to come up with another category. I'm sorry. We'd have to come up with another word to define what the female sex in humans are. And I think that's the argument that we are the argument that we are having, is whether or not that should happen or not as well. Now, when you said against R, who was the R in your statement? I'm just curious. I'm not going to debate.
Our will is actually the majority of living women, because they have no idea what this trend is that's coming from one part of the world, or that their mere existence, the words that are used to describe their existence legally, constitutionally, in every single thing ever written about them, that it's going to be redefined. You're talking about redefining one of the foundational terms in every single language and erasing the reference to half the species in all of written history. Do you really think women are going to lie down and take that? Or do you think that most women in the world are aware of the consequences of that? But let me get back to the consequences thing, that people may suffer. Yes, but the fact that people may or may... Sorry, 1 second.
It's okay.
It's a stupid intersection where people can speed up. Yeah, so firstly, even assuming, just for a second, assuming that you can find another word for the female sex class, you cannot actually use this word properly because circular definitions collapse. Okay, a definition by nature uses other elements to describe the thing that it is defining. If it uses itself as an element, the definition collapses. It's like saying a table is something that's a tall table. It makes no sense. No definition in any dictionary will ever follow that approach.
it doesn't need to be circular. The idea is that women are what society deems to be within a category for a gender role that quote unquote encompasses women. This is not, now I'm being now I understand I am being very in my words right now, I am not being very well. Like I don't know. I'm sorry. I am trying to avoid the circular definition here because it doesn't have to exist, but I am not overly prepared to do so. That is what's happening.
One of the definitions that apparently students of Judith Butler and gender identity theory came up with is this. One second, let me look it up. Who is a woman? A woman is a gender identity one chooses which can be similar or not similar to the person's biological sex. Once you go into the definition of gender identity, that again leads back to the same definition of women as the female sex class. So, and this is by a student of gender studies, right? You keep going around in circles. And I mean, I don't really care, you can keep going around in circles. But the fact is, you cannot meaningfully define or use the word woman in a sense that includes just about everybody without it becoming a tautology or a circular definition, partially because the rationale behind it is so weak. So, getting to, okay, should society therefore go towards this trend or not? You are coming at it from a perspective of consequences because people suffer.
It's not just suffering, but please go on.
Okay, let's assume the restrictive gender rules and redefining the female sex class will release them from gender roles. How? I mean, because you guys do realize that saying a woman is an adult human female does not therefore equal to a woman has to be just a wife, a mother, and stay at home. Those two don't necessarily follow. The fact that societies did that to women is a pure exercise of power. Defining women, or just the mere existence of woman as a female sex class, does not immediately demand or imply gender roles. And redefining them isn't going to get you out of gender roles. Okay,
but
just by
part of the issue is that when we're talking about gender roles, hold on a second, sorry.
Sure.
Damn, I don't have water enough. It's fine. One of the issues that we're talking about is that the restrictive gender roles are attributed to, certain. Actually, my brain just went out on me. Please go ahead. Sorry.
The restrictive gender roles are a result of many complex societal mechanisms, evolutions, historical circumstances. We don't need to go into that right now. But it is not a consequence of the existence of woman and the naming of woman as a sex class. That does not oppress us. That does not lead to gender roles either for men or for women. Because saying you're a man does not imply, therefore you should go to war and always be the one to gather the harvest, which is actually almost always women, or that you should be the one to hunt the big animals. That is a decision we deliberately made in our society for various reasons. Mm-hmm. Saying you're a man does not imply that you have to be the one to go to the coal mines and the sewers, and you, woman, have to be the one to cook and to bear children and to take care of and raise the children. Bearing children, thanks evolution, we've got to that. When the artificial wombs come, we'll have this discussion again. Defining woman as a sex class does not lead to gender roles. Redefining women as not a sex class is not going to liberate them from gender roles or anybody. You don't need that. And that brings me back to the first point, is that what you're proposing, quite flippantly, is that to redefine the term used to describe half the human species without any consideration as to what that could mean for us. That means redefining and distorting every mention of women in history, every law, policy, book, medical text. Has anyone even thought about what that means? I'm pretty sure most of you haven't. Because whenever we confront people with the consequences, their response is, oh, well, we can fix that. Yeah, you can't. You can't. Not after you mess up the definition. That is exactly why definitions are important. So give me a reason as to why you need the category of woman to be redefined. Just because people are trying to get into it? I mean, I'm from a developing country. I can say that I have a great education. I can bring value. That doesn't make me a citizen of a developed country, no matter how much I might wish it. Sometime I might or might not get an opportunity. The fact that I want to belong to something is not and can never be a good reason to include someone into a group that they want to. Would you apply that same logic to people wanting to identify as Native American? If they say they really want to be Native American?
I would say that is a different issue.
Why?
I would say it's primarily a different issue because of cultural implications of that and things of that nature.
Okay, so name one other group into which you can identify just because you want to. Just because you want to.
I would say pretty much any other kind of group that has a direct... Any other kind of group that doesn't have a ethnicity attached to it, pretty much.
Literally every group on the planet will have a problem with that. Because wanting doesn't matter for membership of a social group.
No, but it's
Judaism
not just wanting,
is
though.
passed down.
It's not just wanting, though. So I understand that there are some people out there that will go around looking like me and claim to be a woman. I understand that those people exist. However, most of the vast majority of people that are trans or trans women will try to integrate themselves within said group, and it is the act of integrating that is part of the logic here.
Again, the fact that people want to try, that they can look like it, is never a justification and cannot be used in any other group logic to say that therefore you should
but
be
it
considered
mostly
membership
is. I mean,
in
if you're trying to be an American, you go through the process of trying to become an American, and once you have gone through that process, then by all means, call yourself an American.
I think literally everyone on the border can say that wanting and trying is not enough. That there will be enough and more people who will integrate, who will do the American thing, who will be at the border. That is not how the group get. Social groups, which are actually, again, it's not a great example because the sex class is not a social group. It's a biological group.
But women are a social group, though. We can't deny that they're not, because they are also that women are both, right now, as language defines it, are both a sex group and a gender group, and a gender group is a social group.
No, they're only a sex group. They're not a gender group.
I disagree with that.
How? On what basis?
On the basis of what I've said at the beginning of this conversation, which is the fact that people that integrate themselves within the role of a woman are treated as such by society, and the consequences of that is that they are deemed to be women.
This is again circular. What you just said is that because there are instances of people who may want to be considered as part of this group and may be perceived as part of this group and therefore treated as other members of that group are treated, therefore women are a gender group. That cannot be your basis for saying women are a gender group. Women, if you want to argue women are a gender group and a social group, you need to have an argument for it other than saying because there are instances where people who are perceived as such are treated like it. Because the reason the people who are perceived as such are treated like it is because the treaters assume them to be part of that sex class. Again, which is why you have the whole dating issue.
That's how often that society acts, though. We have another example. Again, I'm coming at this from American perspective, so I'm sure that you have others. But we have what is called white passing, quote unquote. And white passing is when a person of color is perceived by society at large to be white. Now, this does get into the point that it is only a defined period of time. Once the quote unquote truth is found out, then they are treated differently. But during that instance where they are white passing, they are treated and assumed to be white, and therefore the consequences are that they are white.
Yes, but white is a skin color group. Woman is a biological fact of existence.
It's also all the visual and social audio cues that go
because they are a biological class, and the biological class is mostly visually distinctive. You do not have a separate woman gender group. You just have woman as a sex group. And in the instances where you think people are treated like women because they are perceived as women, the presumption there is still that they belong to the sex class, which again is why when men especially find out that actually they're not women, they go a little nuts. That's the consequence. But the point is that the underlying presumption is that of the sex class. Women only exist as a sex class. The gender roles are attributed to them. And again, you can see this in the in language. It's sorry, what happened?
No, I accidentally hit a button. My screen went away. It's fine.
You can see that women are just a sex class in the language itself, because the gender terms depend on women to be in the components of the definition. The feminine gender uses the word woman in the component definition, as do most of the European languages which actually have the concept of gender. Women do not exist as a gender group. Women exist as a sex group. Gender is attributed to them, the feminine gender, and therefore people who look feminine may sometimes be thought of as women, the underlying presumption being that they belong to women as a sex class. Language does not treat women as a gender group, it treats women as a sex group. The only reason this confusion exists is because when you're not considering what actually is going on when someone looks at a feminine person and thinks they're a woman, or looks at a masculine person and thinks they're a man, which they may not be. But femininity is the gender class, not women.
Okay. I would be okay with saying that trans women are feminine, but I also am okay with them saying that they're women. I don't have that the issue that you have with it.
The issue I have with it is because it's misrepresentation. Trans women can be feminine all they want. They can drag queens are feminine. You can have a robot. Now you have sex dolls which are feminine. Call yourself feminine. I don't fucking care, because the word feminine.
A robot, a sex robot that is woman defined, a woman sex robot.
What? Sorry, I didn't get that.
You just brought up sex robots, and I said I'm pretty sure in language we would call it a woman's sex robot.
Yeah, you would call them a women sex robot. You would call it a feminine sex robot. That's because, again, in the English language, people tend to use the words feminine and woman sometimes differently, or womanly, rather. You would call it a womanly sex robot, ly, changing the word woman into an adverb, which in fact derives from the word woman, again, as a sex class. The word woman only describes a sex class, ever, always. Which is why you could consider feminine sex robots. You might call them womanly. You could call them, I don't know, and some of the other descriptive words that can be derived from the noun women, but they're never just called women. And that is why the slogan trans women are women is a lie. Because you're not saying trans women should be perceived as feminine. You're not saying trans women should be treated as women. You're saying they are. That's an assertion. And in this instance, if I could just respond to David Miller's comment on the group. just because you want to is a gross mischaracterization of gender dysmorphia. Well, according to current trans rhetoric, people don't even need to really have dysphoria or body dysmorphia. He's mixing two things up. Gender dysphoria is one thing, body dysmorphia is the other, in order to be considered trans. But that is also not my argument. My argument is that wanting to be anything is not a basis to be considered in any group. And you would not do this to Black people. You would not do this to Native Americans. They would kick your ass, and rightly. There are criterion to be considered a part of a group. The criterion to be considered a woman is being female. And that's it. That's really just it. And in terms of consequences, two things. One, the consequences of trans women not being considered women is actually zero. They actually benefit from not being considered women. Because however you may be treated as, if you are not actually a woman, you are at less risk from certain aspects of treatment. In certain aspects, you are at more risk. And secondly, in order to gain equal rights, you do not ever need to be considered as part of a class that you do not generally belong to. The point of equal rights is for it to be available to everyone, and they do. Trans people do have civil rights in the US, in most of the world. In some cases, it needs better enforcement. They should absolutely not be discriminated against because they're trans. But none of those rights or the interests that are being sought to be protected by those rights require that they be treated as the opposite sex class, which they do not belong to. It doesn't require that. In fact, if you define them as just trans, you could probably argue for protected status as a whole different group. On the consequences of redefining women, on the other hand, is tremendous. And it's insanely dangerous for women and for men, actually, once you get into it. But the consequences of redefining a foundational term is something that almost nobody in this debate has thought about, except us unfortunate feminists, because this is something we actually have to spend our nights and days on. Our histories are being rewritten. Crime statistics are being misreported. And we're supposed to be okay with this because a butch lesbian can get treated badly in a bathroom. And by the way, butch lesbians, as you know, so correctly noted, are women. Calling trans women as women did not stop her oppression there.
Well, the reason the reason that she was stopped was because of the bathroom bills. Which were designed in order to moralistically try to separate trans people in general from the larger society body politic.
No, the bathroom bills were meant to restrict people to their actual sex bathrooms because the bathrooms are sex segregated. I've looked into those bills. And by the way,
the bills in the United States were morally, religiously founded. It had very little to do with the sex class argument.
The bathrooms in the US are sex segregated.
There is segregated.
Exactly.
Yes, and they're sex segregated because they didn't want women into the men's restrooms or vice versa for different cultural reasons. Before they were sex segregated, they were unisex. The reason behind the bathroom bills though was religious and moral based. It was not sex based. They used the sex argument in order to try to give it more validity to people that weren't paying attention, but it was mostly founded upon religious principles, and it was done so in order to segregate trans people from the wider body politic.
The imputation of motives to the bills by everyone in this debate is really easy. But the fact is the bathrooms were sex segregated, and they're not sex segregated for moral reasons, not just. Sex segregation.
Most of it was for cultural reasons. The first sex segregated bathrooms happened in upper middle class restaurants and things like that, in order for the men to be able to be away from the women and go to like powder rooms and things like that. It wasn't because of the fear that men would rape women and all that stuff. It was separate the categories between them in order to implement power differentials and things like that.
Sex segregated spaces exist in some form in most of the world, in most cultures. And yes, there are cultural reasons in some cases. But culture itself is also a result of other imperatives in society, which may or may not be recognized. In most cases, sex segregated spaces are there to give women and men privacy while carrying out bathroom activities. Because the two sexes being together, especially for women, induces discomfort. Which is why even today, UNICEF.
Do you think that discomfort is a natural outgrowth, or is it
Yes.
something that? So you believe that women are naturally naturally by biology or whatever are afraid to go to the restroom around men, or do you think it's a cultural thing or a patriarchy thing that causes that to be the thing?
I think that the word. Okay, I'll get to that. I think that the word natural is not necessarily biological. I think that there are logical reasons born out of instinctive reactions that people can have. It is as simple as wanting to lock the door. Okay? So, one thing. Secondly, sex segregated spaces exist in some form throughout society. Most human rights organizations today will tell you that sex segregated bathrooms are essential to keep girls in school everywhere in the world. Not just bathrooms, sex segregated bathrooms. Because when they come of age, they require privacy. And there are many reasons why you do not live in communal settings anymore. There are many reasons why dorms are separated. There are many reasons why the sexual dynamics between the sexes are complicated. It's also why, as children grow up beyond a point, even teenagers are not particularly comfortable sharing the same room and bathroom with their younger brothers, which they might have done when they're children. Even if, assuming it's a very healthy family environment and actually nothing untoward is going on. Sex segregated spaces, why the culture evolved like this, we have many reasons. We can have theories. The fact is, we do not have the capacity to rewind to a point where we can actually figure out whether the discomfort of both sexes, by the way, not just women, boys don't, especially teenage boys, young boys don't like being around girls in a certain setting any more than girls do. Sex segregated spaces serve the purpose of growth, of privacy, of autonomy, especially away from the other sex, given that most of the world is heterosexual. So irrespective of why it may have started, particularly in the US, to generalize from that sex segregated spaces are undesirable is an extreme exercise of privilege. Because fine, let me take that back. Why sex segregated spaces may have arisen, especially in the United States, is irrelevant. The fact is they're a universal phenomenon for very good reasons. And the bathroom bills, which is where they started, were meant to maintain the sex segregation. Imputation of motives, right-wing religious motives, they just want to make trans people feel bad. We can go on theorizing. But the effect of it is to maintain the sex spaces. And the reason the butch lesbians get harassed is not because of gender roles or non-conformity. It's because there was a ham-fisted attempt by one sector of society that did not think this through and to say, now anyone can enter, because now you destroyed social trust. Earlier, a butch lesbian may have gotten a look, but there was an underlying presumption that only women would enter the women's bathroom. After that, once social trust is destroyed, that's when you get people asking questions, because now you're assuming someone is breaking the law. Because the federal government allowed for people to use bathrooms according to gender identity. You destroy the social fabric around sex segregated spaces.
I'm sorry, I'll let you finish and then I'll go back. Sorry.
Okay, yeah, I'm almost done. But yeah, the only reason non-conforming women get treated badly in certain spaces now is because the original assumption that those spaces were respected as women-only spaces has now been lost. And now everybody's suspicious of everybody else. You didn't actually have this much of harassment or questions before, because now women don't know. Women can't be sure who is in the bathroom. So now you tend to ask based on passing. And the people that caught up on it are, yes, actually non-conforming people. Go ahead.
So the thing that I rudely interrupted you on that I wanted to make a point with was the fact that the federal government allowed it. It wasn't so much the federal government, it was businesses themselves that were allowing it by not making any point whatsoever to disallow it. This is why I said this was a religious moral argument for at least the United States to try to quote unquote enforce sex segregated bathrooms. One of the questions that I had for you is I should have wrote it down. For the sex segregation, you said that it's no, you already addressed this point. So sorry, I'm a little tongue-tied right now.
There is
Go ahead.
There is an executive order by Obama which allowed people to use bathrooms according to what they thought were their gender identity, rather than by sex segregated spaces. The bathroom bills were a response to that, which said, no, you have to follow your sex-specified spaces. And now the consequence of that is
I think the bathroom bills came first, and then the federal government came in and tried to get it through Title IX to circumvent those. I could be wrong, but that's my impression.
I will check back on dates on that as well, because I specifically remember looking this up, and there was an executive order that facilitated it. Gender identity bathroom bills are a ham-fisted attempt as well, but non-conforming people suffer not when they've been, not because of sex segregation, they suffer because of breakdown of social trust. The breakdown has been initiated by this movement, because it is now, the social perception now is that you can't trust anyone who doesn't look very typically like a woman without a lot of effort, could potentially be trans or a man, and the entire fabric is gone. So in terms of who's really getting affected by, or rather in terms of the bad consequences on non-conforming people, might want to look into who started that. Because a lot of spaces are maintained. This is one particularly maddening argument that I've unfortunately had to encounter millions of times. How are you going to check who goes into the bathrooms? Are you going to check their pants? Wow.
Can you say that again? Your audio just went really low for that section.
Sorry, I was saying that it's a very popular argument by trans activists to say, well, if you want to separate bathrooms by sex, how are you going to enforce that? Are you going to start checking people's genitals? Are you going to check their pants? This is a painfully stupid argument. It's incredibly stupid.
Well, I mean, that's what was kind of happening, though. They were checking IDs in order to, they were basically IDing people that were going in that weren't passing or what have you, which I find to be reprehensible in itself, regardless of whether or not people are going to have to drop their pants and show their genitals.
The issue, again, the incidents that you're referring to is after the backlash started happening, and not how sex-segregated spaces have traditionally been maintained. Sex-segregated spaces, much like most of the sacred spaces, are maintained on a basis of trust and social norms.
I agree with that.
You don't exactly need a law enforcer standing at every bathroom door to enforce that only people of a certain sex go in there, because we as a society, before this thing started becoming so obvious, and at the time, passing people could use that as well, because there was a general sense of social trust and people were not asking questions. So the notion that sex-segregated spaces to enforce the boundary requires invasive genital checking is a terrible straw man brought up by people who apparently should not be let out of school. Because sex-segregated spaces and many other sacred spaces, for instance, have never required the checking of IDs or an enforcement mechanism to be maintained. The boundaries are maintained through social trust, through fear of consequences, and through general social consequences, consciousness.
Hmm.
And this debate is carried on by people who have no idea how this is maintained, or who haven't actually taken the 15 seconds that it takes to think about this. We have sex segregated metro cabins in a lot of developing countries. The metro compartment is still attached to the rest of the train. There is no dividing line. It's literally one compartment, and then the rest of the train is both sexes mixed. The women's compartment will very rarely be bridged. It's an open space. You can literally see the line, and you don't even have to cross a changing compartment. How do you think those boundaries are maintained? Social norms. And the thing is, most women immediately know this. And yet, we've had to answer to thousands of men asking us, oh, how are you going to enforce sex segregated spaces? Because apparently this didn't work for the last century or so.
Well, that again, I think that's because the laws came into effect to try to reinforce these things while society itself was changing what was and is not, what is and is not a woman. Now, not broad society. I mean, there's certain sectors of the population that still, not certain sectors. There's probably large swaths, I'll say, to be more fair, that have the opinion that you do, which is that women are sex. Women is a sex category. Sex category separations should exist in various forms throughout society, as it is beneficial to both men and women in order to have these distinct roles. Another part of society believes that gender and that women are gender. Gender should be, now it's a very tiny bit of people that are actually gender abolitionist. They tend to be leftist in nature or radicals. Some liberals believe this now too, at least within the United States. I can't speak for the rest of the world, where the social implications of woman are largely socially defined, and therefore, if we expand the category of woman to include trans women and call trans women just women, then those issues will simply fall away over time. Now, one of the things...
It's not really up to society to decide that.
I would say that the most of the stuff that we've been talking about is up to society whether or not to decide that or not. I do understand that biology plays a role within this, but I think a lot of the things that we have been talking about for the last 10 minutes or so are largely socially defined and therefore can be broadened in order to include things. For example, you say that social trust is maintained for a variety of social cues and cultural norms and things like that. I don't see an issue with how expanding trans women into these social norms and rules for quote-unquote sex segregated spaces breaks the social trust over the long run as people get more familiarized with what is and is not a trans woman. So for you, why is social trust hard to maintain by allowing trans women to be in these sex segregated spaces and to be considered women? The root of the issue, I think that will help answer the root of our disagreement.
No, that's not. The root of the issue is this. In some cases, due to passing, it is possible that people who do not belong to the sex class or the sex category can nevertheless access these facilities because they are largely maintained by social trust. One second.
It's okay.
The social trust and social norms point was in response to the argument or to the assertion that maintaining sex segregated spaces is necessarily going to be invasive and undignified and reprehensible. My point there is...
I just wanted to make it clear that I'm talking about legally enforcing these things. Socially enforcing these things, not necessarily. Just want to make that clarification. Once
the legal rules in place are known, social norms and social behaviors follow. Mudding of the legal norms breaks the social context around which the legal norms operate. Legal and social are not easily separated, which is, again, something that most of us are acutely aware of because we actively work in the we actually think about how a legal norm affects a social norm and therefore social behavior. If the law is muddied, social trust, or rather social norms, then change. And in your case with the bathroom bills, what they did was break the pre-existing social trust, which ended up with non-conforming women being questioned. Now, but here's my point. As long as the legal norms are clear, social norms remain in place and can carry out their purpose, and non-conforming people do not necessarily need to suffer. The non-passing people are still going to be in a bit of a jam, but that is a different issue. How we sort out the, shall we say, the policy side effects is a different problem. That is always there with any policy. There are always some effects that can be fixed ultimately. But in order to maintain social trust, you need the legal norms underlying the social norms to be clear as well. Once you muddy them, the entire structure collapses. Secondly, why do I have a problem with it? I can't and don't particularly care about passing or at any given moment someone who's trans who absolutely needs to use the women's bathroom. As long as I can trust that for the most part it's only women in that space. If you pass a law like this, and if you change the social fabric around it, then I have to think twice about who is in the bathroom with me.
But isn't
And
that I'm sorry to break in.
no,
Isn't
no,
that
no,
true
go
of
ahead.
any social change that is kind of on the edges of what has been normally accepted? Um, I hate to keep relying on my cultural biases here, but I mean that's what happened during the civil rights movement when social norms started to change and people were breaking laws or social taboos by sitting at all white lunch counters and that sort of thing. And like I said, I believe that it was the religious right that made the first move on this after losing Oberfell, and gay people being allowed to marry. That's where I'm coming from this.
Okay. Yes, whenever a social norm changes, there is a certain amount of discomfort. That is true.
Hmm.
However, the fact that there is discomfort cannot just be dismissed because it's uncomfortable.
I don't think it
They,
was being dismissed. I don't think it was being entirely dismissed. It was being ridiculed, but I don't think that's the same thing.
no, no,
And not by everybody either. Like I would totally understand why somebody might be uncomfortable with a trans woman entering the women's restroom because, you know, let's be real, women do get raped by men, by biological men, and some women will believe that they're going to exploit it in order to do these things.
my thing is here. So, two things. One is that, okay, well, isn't that true of every social change? Yes, it is true of every social change that when change occurs, there's a discomfort around it. But how that discomfort should be treated, whether it should be legitimized or not, whether it should be validated or not, depends on the basis for that discomfort. When the civil rights movement, the analogy to the civil rights movement is improper because that was black people being excluded from regular society and from places
Hmm.
where, from a egalitarian perspective, they had a right to be in. There was no reason to get them out of those spaces except prejudice.
I
It
would
is
say
not
that
comparable.
I would say that it's very similar, at least
How?
approximately very similar to the
How?
trans issue,
We are
because
keeping them
it's
out because they are the other sex class.
we're kicking them out because you perceive them to be the other sex class.
No, we're kicking them out because they are the other sex class. That's the difference. In
Okay,
fact,
and
in your example, we would perceive them to be of our sex class. But if we were to find out the truth, the reason we do not want the social change to take place is because they're of the opposite sex class. The other sex class, whom we
black
have,
people were being prevented from being able to enter spaces for only white people because they're of the opposite race class.
yes, and the
We're
reason for that was
cultural issues, racism. I would say that it's very similar for trans people. I say very similar because I do recognize the fact that that male and female humans are actually there are some differences, but there's a ton of overlap. Trying to be fair.
The racism argument is inapplicable because there is no rational reason for black people and white people to not share the same space. Whereas there is a very good reason, there is a very rational reason why we have sex segregated spaces.
Is it?
And it is not simply based on dislike. Sorry?
Why is that? What is the very rational reason?
The very rational reason is that is of privacy, is of autonomy, which sexual dynamics interfere with.
Do you think those things are interfered with on an inherent? Well, okay, we already discussed this. Please go on. You already said that inherent can have different meanings.
White people having a discomfort with black people has no basis other than the fact of them being just thinking that they're inferior. We don't think men are inferior. Okay, but the sex segregated spaces exist because of A, safeguarding, B, gender safety, 3, privacy. Okay? Privacy in turn, which is related to the imperative for both sexes to feel comfortable and therefore autonomy. Now, a couple of people who pass will not cause the disturbance because the prevailing social framework exists. But what you're asking us to do is to be okay with men in our private spaces. And to that, I'm saying no, absolutely not. We do not want male people in those spaces. And it is not based on fear of trans people. It's based on not wanting men in those spaces, males.
And okay, I understand that, but why is letting trans women into these spaces? Why is accepting trans women as women?
Two different points there.
Letting
them into spaces as an exception is one thing. Accepting them as women is another thing. Two different points there.
Okay, that's fine to see it that way. The crux of my question is what is lost by letting trans women into these spaces?
I answered your question already. If we have to change the structure in order to accommodate for a small subset of men, that's a widening gap. And then we have to be okay with anyone claim. Firstly, now you don't even have the requirement of, the people who get in there are only, operated on. That's not even true anymore. 90% are not, haven't undergone any kind of medical surgical transition.
I don't see why that's relevant.
It absolutely is relevant because what you're asking us to do is to accept male people who look like women on the basis of them being trans and to change the overall structure. Remember, I'm still saying I cannot possibly know if a person who passes is in the space anyway. What I am saying is that if I do know that we're not going to accept male people in these spaces because we have a prerogative to avoid male people. Them being trans does not change the fact that they're male. That's what we're losing. What we're losing is the boundary. What we're losing is the boundary between the boundary that is formed by the fact of the sex segregated spaces. The boundary that says beyond this point, men not allowed. Or for the men's bathroom, beyond this point, women not allowed. I mean, if you guys don't want the boundary, I don't particularly care. I wouldn't reach it, because I respect the same thing. But our boundary is that we do not want to change the boundary or the expectation of the boundary just for one small subset that you claim will always be a small subset. Even assuming, let me give you the benefit of the doubt. Let's assume that it's only people who truly need that. Let's assume that it's always going to just be a very small number. Mm-hmm. What I'm saying is that I will not consent to the change of the boundary itself. It is still possible that some people can't reach the boundary without consequences because of passing. Fine, we can't do anything about that. As long as they don't cause problems and we don't have to respond to that, whatever. But the boundary, the point of the boundary, the criterion for the boundary remains the same. Because if we expand that, then what we're essentially saying is we have to allow certain people who are male because they claim something else. And that is not acceptable to us because that erodes our boundary.
Okay. I probably understand why you're hesitant to have this boundary, the social boundary, fall to the wayside, we'll say. But I don't want to assume anything. So what is the primary reason why you are uncomfortable with this boundary being lessened to allow trans women in?
I mean, we've already gone over this.
No, you didn't. You didn't give me. You didn't give me a clear answer, in my opinion.
Okay. Women do not want this boundary to be broken down because these spaces are important for women to feel safe in a slightly vulnerable position, which is, essentially disposal of human waste. It's already something that most people in the world are not exactly comfortable doing in front of everybody. Okay. There's already an expectation of privacy. And to the extent that you can share that, and again, with sex segregated spaces, while we are talking about bathrooms, that of course includes refuges,
there's all sorts of different places.
Yeah.
I understand.
Wards. And by the way, the passing issue only occurs with bathrooms and not with nothing else, because everywhere else ID comes into the picture. Everywhere else, whether it could be refuges or domestic shelters or wards or hostels or locker rooms, and all of that, ID and actual identity comes into the picture. The only sex segregated space where even passing is possible to not be policed is bathrooms. Everywhere else, ID is sufficient and the boundary can be maintained strictly. Why do we want that boundary? Because it is important for women in all of these instances to be free of male presence. It is important for them.
Is it important for women to be free of male presence or a man's presence?
Male presence. It is important for women to be free of male presence in these spaces, whether it be bathrooms or locker rooms or shelters.
So this gets to the biological argument. So women need to have biological men away from these spaces in order to feel comfortable.
No, women need to have male people away from these spaces to feel comfortable. Okay, actually, yes, so the same. Biological men, yeah. Women need to have men away from these spaces.
How?
To feel comfortable.
Why?
This is again the crux of the debate, where we are. Firstly, I am okay with answering these questions. Not the crux of the debate. This is the part which enrages us, because we are not allowed to say that in our most vulnerable instances we want to be comfortable without having to justify it at multiple levels. How is that not an exercise of male entitlement?
I would say that this would be the same for any other socially constructed debate where I would have not an issue with, but a lack of understanding for somebody's position. I don't.
A lack of understanding, or
I don't believe that this is me coming at it from a male perspective. I believe this is me coming out from a social perspective, not the fact that I'm a biological male that might one day, for whatever reason, this is the argument I've heard from a lot of for lack of a better term, radical feminist. For lack of a better term, not calling you one. Where I get to the argument that, well, you're only saying that because you're a man and therefore you could see yourself being in that position. No, that's not why I'm coming at this angle.
No, what I mean is, what I'm trying to say is different. It's to say that, tell me why you need me out of this space, and just saying we want that to feel comfortable is not good enough. The articulation of that question, the mention of that question, is an exercise in entitlement, because you're essentially saying we cannot have any standards of our own for our sense of comfort, for our maybe female determined sense of comfort, call it whatever you want, for our group determined sense of comfort and privacy and autonomy. And we've said this is our line, and you're also saying, well, not good enough, tell me more about why you need it.
Because I like to understand where people's core arguments lie. It doesn't matter what the person is. I've asked the same thing from various nationalist groups, and I've gotten the exact same response that you're giving me now. That's because well, I'm of this group, and I think that this is the way it should be.
Okay, well, I'm still going to state that I think the asking of that question is an exercise in entitlement, but I'll still go ahead and answer that question. It is because there is a sense of, when it comes to bathrooms, embarrassment, okay, privacy with bodily functions, which women share, which unbelievably apparently men just do not understand, but women do. We understand the.
Go ahead. Sorry,
It's as it is. A mother in the UK actually explained it very well. She said, my daughter does not want to rip open a tampon packet if she thinks a boy is standing near the sinks. You're going to go tell the 12-year-old already struggling with her first period that she should feel okay with ripping a tampon packet? I mean, it's okay for me as a grown woman to talk like this, but there is a reason that UNICEF and every human rights organization pushes for sex segregated spaces just in order to keep women in the public space. And a little bit of history education will also show that as long as women couldn't have their own spaces, that effectively eliminated them from public spaces. Are you really going to tell women that your feelings of embarrassment don't matter, your feelings of privacy don't matter, your feelings of comfort don't matter? I've attended to emergencies for other women in the women's restroom, emergencies that only women can understand, emergencies that is part of our collective experience. And for that reason, I do not want the boundary to be breached. The boundary to be breached. Like I said, in the case of bathrooms, passing people will still get away with it. But the conceptual boundary cannot be breached. Because this is, and especially when it comes to young girls or religious women, that space is important. It is where we go to take care of young girls. And it also does function as a crime control mechanism, although most lay people don't understand how. The bathroom is where girls, actually both sexes are vulnerable. I'm sure that a bunch of young boys will not like it if a girl was to saunter in while you're standing in line at the urinals. It'd probably be traumatizing for everybody. But anyway.
I would say that these are culturally enforced feelings of embarrassment that we are talking about that should fall away. I don't think a young girl ought to feel, and this is ought, not whether or not she does, a young girl ought to feel embarrassed by her first period. I don't think that a woman ought to feel embarrassed while she does a natural biological function just because a man might be a male might be in the area. This is ought. I'm not saying that this doesn't exist. I'm saying that this probably should not exist.
I mean, leave alone the sex segregated spaces. There are various social conventions around taking a dump in your date's apartment, for example, or at a party.
It's a social fall.
Why do you think those exist?
Why do I think it does exist? Cultural reasons. You don't want you don't want to stink up the place because you're trying to make a good first impression.
People don't even want to disclose their bodily functions to extended family. That's why the family and the home are so private. I mean, if people really want to think that you can deconstruct and eliminate all of this from the human experience, go for it. I don't believe that can be done because there are a lot of these precautions that are just instinctive. It's as much as like we've learned, it's part of the evolutionary instinct of just why human beings, even in the hunter-gathering times, would go behind the bushes to do this as opposed to like while they're walking.
No, I agree. And what I'm saying is that we have it as socially acceptable for people to use public restrooms use public restrooms just in general. And a person that is doing their business within a public space, I don't think that whether or not they are of the opposite sex should necessarily matter. And
Well,
as far as
on that, I was about. I mean, because okay, it's 1.5 hours, and while this thing's about whether they are women, and I've made my arguments for that. Why there are sex segregated spaces, nobody is going to be okay. Not nobody. And most people, except for apparently the Workers' Day, are okay with letting go of sex segregated spaces.
I mean,
And
you're seeing
certainly not parents. And
you're
certainly not parents.
and I think that that is caused by cultural issues. I don't think this is something that is inherent into the human condition. When I say inherent, I mean part of human nature in general. I think these are things that now we can talk about. Like every animal in the face of the planet wants to go to do their business probably away from other people or whatever, right? Like or
Not
other things. They
animals.
not always, but a lot of animals try to get some sort of privacy because of the natural protection of it and the vulnerable position. I understand that, but we live in a we live as a social species in a society where we have public restrooms and other public spaces where we do X, Y, and Z, and I don't think that sex should be a determinant of whether or not you're comfortable with that.
I think that
And I
that's
think
not
that
a decision that only one side gets to make.
I don't think and
That
nobody said anything about one side. This is where I'm talking about the contention between a social change. So there's anytime a social change happens, there's gonna be contention between the two sides that are taking a position. But do you think it's only men that are pushing this? Because in my experience, it's mostly women that are intersectional feminists.
it's one bunch of women. It's one very specific age group of women. Mostly not.
In my experience, I will have to disagree with that. In my experience, it is a certain type of feminist, but not necessarily a certain type of age group for said
Yeah, the
feminist.
Workers' Day, basically. They're all
I
going to
don't
find
know,
out
not
what
the Wokus
happens.
Day. Not the Wokus Day. I think that this is a schism that probably came about during the second wave of feminism, and you're still rippling through this day.
I mean, it may, yes, it is a certain group of feminists, but they are not representative of, firstly, most feminists,
I can't
except
say.
maybe in the West. In
Well,
the
again,
West,
like
this thing is,
I can agree with
it's
that.
hard to say who is, it's very hard to say how big this group is because while it's kind of like Twitter and the overrepresentation. While they are the loudest, they don't in terms of elections and in terms of women actually when you actually start looking into the numbers, they don't seem to have that much support. And to the extent that they do have support, it's based on very superficial reasoning, such as, oh, well, we don't hate them. Therefore, of course, that's okay. But once people realize the consequences of it, which is the
I think that's
erosion of
condescending, to be
boundaries,
honest.
we've seen this. We've actually run surveys, and we've seen that especially when parents realize what this means, they're not very happy with it, and they immediately change their minds
And we can
because it's
when we're talking about surveys, there's statistics and lying statistics, right? Like everybody can agree that we can manipulate statistics in order to say what
fair
we want
enough.
under conditions where we don't want to be morally honest. So when you say when parents realize what this actually means, to me that sounds like that somebody that was taking the survey then put into place certain political leanings into the survey in order to get people to change their mind. Now, I'm not saying that
Uh,
that's what happened. I'm saying that that's the connotation that I take away from it.
okay, well, I think understandably surveys can be manipulated in the ways that you suggest, but you will also see this sentiment in the fact that a lot of schools and offices which went ahead and enforced this change, thinking that it was representative, are now seeing a pushback from parents. At least I know that this has happened in the UK, and I am also aware that this has happened in certain government buildings that enforced unisex toilets. But one last point is that to go back to your thing about, well, maybe these hesitancies are all cultural, whatever,
Hmm.
assuming that were true and
Hmm.
assuming you could get to a point where it doesn't matter, we're not
Hmm.
there yet, that just means completely unisex, not just an erosion of the boundary in sex segregated spaces.
Yeah,
So,
I wouldn't
yeah,
disagree
okay.
with that. The long term consequences of this is that more and more sex segregated spaces would fall to the wayside. People become more and more comfortable. That's just how social evolution works. I
No,
understand. Yeah.
That is how you wish it works in this case, in
No.
this particular topic.
Like, no, if people get more and more comfortable with this, then those that aren't comfortable with it will start to find ways in order to force the sex segregation in their spaces, and that I am fine with them doing so in their private spaces. That is fine. The issue that we're talking about is whether or not it's society's job role in order to enforce these things through government um, laws or whatever, or whether or not this is a thing that ought to be rather than a thing that is. I would say that we ought to not, like, going back to the example of the tampon thing. I don't think a young girl should be embarrassed about her natural body functions. And I think that men should be actually taught more about how the female anatomy works in order to lessen other complications.
Well, irrespective of what you and I might think of what could be in 100 years
Mm-hmm.
from now,
Mm-hmm.
that is not the case. Firstly, that's not the case right now.
Yes, that's true.
So, unless and until society has changed on that level, to even demand that the first experiments, the first guinea pigs in this experiment be women and girls is extremely misogynistic. Okay, because
I don't think
that's
it's
not where we
their
are right
first
now.
experiment. I think that
It is.
trans people of both sexes are quote unquote the experiment because this is what is happening. It's not just girls and women that are experiencing these things. It is also men and boys that are experiencing these things. We can say that it might be to a lesser extent given the nature that it seems that more trans women exist than trans men, but we're not entirely sure about that because, again, cultural hangups about what is and is not proper.
Irrespective of, firstly, trans people, since they don't fall into the two major sex classes, definitely have undergone a certain amount of marginalization. However, the idea that by reaching the boundaries things will be improved is an experiment on the primary beneficiaries of the sex segregated spaces. Because while we are still in a place, and I do not for a second believe that those imperatives can be gotten rid of, to change the surrounding architecture before already having changed society is an experiment on women and girls, and yes, to a certain extent on boys and men as well. But considering that they seem to be less impacted, the experiment is therefore misogynistic because you run an experiment on the beneficiaries of the sex segregated spaces without actually asking whether society has changed. In fact, trans people are not the experiments in the sex segregated spaces. They were not considered. The solution to that would have been extra facilities.
Extra
Okay,
facilities
not
gets into the argument of separate but equal, at least within the
well.
United
No,
States.
it's not. It's a terrible analogy, just like the civil rights analogy.
No, I disagree.
Othering is okay. We don't have the time to get into that right now. But the point is, your argument that okay, well, I would like it to be like this. This ought to be like this, but without having gotten society to that point to change the surrounding architecture around women and girls and men and boys, runs them as experiments because society hasn't gotten there yet.
Isn't that how all social change happens? Is within an
No,
experiment?
no,
You
no.
think that all social changes are just a natural evolution from point A to point B without any contentions of people saying this is not what should be?
So that's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying that the problem here is what it should be. The problem here is not the disagreement between you and me on what should be. The problem here is that while you may want a society where a teenage girl does not need to feel uncomfortable, we're not there yet. And
yes, but we
before we're there, the surrounding architecture was changed without consideration. That's the experiment that I'm talking about. Because, I mean, if you think that you can create a society like that, be my guest. Go ahead and create that society. And then you can try out their unisex facilities. But while we are not there yet to change the surrounding architecture, it's an experiment. And a ruthless one.
I would say that that's kind of a cop-out, to be honest, because anytime there's any grand social change, there's going to be an issue of what people are used to and what the change that is being implemented is happening. So ergo, anytime you have these grand social changes, is that you're going to have the schism between our debate here, where we have people that are like, well, you shouldn't do this, and because it's not there yet. And then somebody from my position would be like, well, how do we get there? Where do we get there? Most of the instances throughout human history where social changes has occurred is that it has been a quote unquote experiment in order to get to that position through either changes in social order or law, and you have an eventual breakthrough where people are like, okay, this worked or this didn't work. There's always going to be an issue. There's always going to be a point of contention where you have the transition period that has a quote unquote experiment happening, because that's how transition periods just work.
No, no, no. Hang on. 1 second. Firstly, not every social change is enforced or carried out in the same way.
I didn't say it
Okay?
was.
Well, you were trying to generalize across board of a number of social changes.
I will
Social
say that
changes.
social change. So let me clarify, and then I will stop interrupting you, and I'm sorry for that. Is that social changes in general that cause a schism between what is and ought to be necessitates some form of experimentation in order to find where those new boundaries lie. So it's one of those situations where I don't think you can get around from it, and therefore I don't see how this is anything that's in particular to women or any other group, any other social group, where there's been a schism between what people think should be, ought to be, and is, and the other people on the other side saying, no, it should be this. Please continue.
Okay, I get that, right? But every time there is a social change can occur in various ways. Sometimes it occurs through law, sometimes it occurs organically, sometimes it occurs through a massive shift in both the legal and social structures. Not all of it is accompanied by discomfort, not all of it is accompanied by resistance. And even if it is accompanied by discomfort and resistance, it is not of a nature that can fundamentally affect the people expressing the discomfort and resistance. Sure, there was opposition to gay marriage, but a lot of what people said was like, look, dude, it literally doesn't affect you, and it doesn't. Okay, there can be no rational argument made that the fact of gay marriage affected straight marriages in any appreciable way, because straight marriages are not going to reduce because gay people are getting married. But in this case, in this particular instance of social change, change in extremely intricate and intimate sexual dynamics is forced on people without consideration for whether society was there or not. And by the way, a lot of social changes that are enforced like this top down without consideration of whether society is there yet often fail spectacularly. Sometimes they don't, but mostly they do. So my point is, you can't just say, oh, well, you generally have social change, people are uncomfortable, all right, or that's just part of social change. No, because a social change that is going to cause damage to a certain group, or at least one group says it causes damage, has to be handled differently from a social change that doesn't actually damage anybody. All social changes are not equal. And that is not at all a defensible argument. And yeah, sure, a lot of social changes, may cause discomfort, and people protest and they say, no, we think it shouldn't be like this. That is true. And a lot of them are ignored. And then 20 years later, people end up having to apologize for those things. Okay, this is exactly.
I would say that that's a inherent issue of the kind of social change that we're talking about. It doesn't matter what it applies to. I would say that any time that this kind of level of discomfort is triggered, for lack of a better term, it's triggered by social change, whether it's top down or not, is inherent to the process, and that discomfort does not necessitate whether or not that is a thing that is or is not, or it should or should not be, rather.
I do get. You're still conflating a lot of different social changes and the level of discomfort and the costs imposed on the people who are being experimented upon as somehow defensible and excusable on the basis that, well, this is how social change occurs. That's absolutely not.
This is how social change occurs. This is how social change that includes this level of discomfort tends to occur.
Not necessarily. You had a lot of discomfort surrounding gay marriage as well. In most other societies, you had lower, and not just in American society, in a lot of other societies, you had massive social changes that were enforced in order to bring up the lower classes.
Mm-hmm.
And it was met with a lot of discomfort.
And riots and resistance and revolution.
Yes, and this is not
guillotining the upper class. Like I don't see how this helps your argument.
It helps my argument because not all social changes are the same, and who is being affected by the social change is relevant. Okay, you're comparing all of this, all your analogies are to previous examples of oppressed people rising up against their oppressors. What, this is trans people rising up against women oppressing them?
No,
because they're not
women. Society.
Okay, well, yeah, so society decides to sacrifice the women and girls who are existing today because society oppressed them in the past.
No, because society is going through a transitional period where it's trying to figure out the bounds of what this discussion is. You had said that from what I gathered, I put down a little note, is that you would think that this is you referenced that top-down changes are often jettisoned in the future and very much fail. This is not to me, this is not a top-down issue. This is an organic rising issue led primarily by interconnectedness that we have gathered from being online, and being online and social creatures tended to accelerate this transitional period. That's where I think it is. I don't think this is top down at all. I think this is people trying to find where these bounds are, and that discomfort doesn't necessarily mean that discomfort is justified. The point that you brought up for parents being discomforted about what that means for their kids, that doesn't mean that their discomfort is morally justified. I'll say their discomfort does exist, and it should be redressed in a way that is amicable to everybody involved. However, that doesn't mean it's something that is morally justifiable.
Okay, so there's 2 points in there. Okay. One is that whether it was a top-down approach, I will get to that. 2 is that a social change can affect some people. Sometimes it need not actually affect the people who are protesting for various reasons. Okay, and just because you have a few analogies where you get to say, well, they also said discomfort, that is not a proper analogy. You cannot possibly analogize a social change on the basis that there have been other instances where people have met a social change with discomfort. People have met lots of social changes with lots of different reactions. And if you're going to make an analogy, you should really make that on the basis of this is why the analogy is applicable. This is how the social changes were similar. Okay. Now you might say, yes, well, when the civil rights movement happened and when segregation was tried to bring down, people were uncomfortable. And you would think that's a winning argument. It's not, because the basis of the discomfort there cannot be analogized to this. What you have here, and which goes back to whether you find the discomfort justifiable, you can't actually make an argument that it's not justifiable. Your best argument right now is, I hope maybe you think, and on this even the intersectional feminists are not agreed upon, that all of the reasons for which we need sex segregated spaces are not good enough, or that they can be changed. You have no evidence, you have no reason to believe that this will fructify. Maybe it will. Good luck to you. I don't particularly care. But it hasn't. Okay? So it cannot be analogized to the civil rights thing because there is no moral component to this. There is a very rational common sense. No, there is
from a consequentialist perspective. By preventing trans women passing or not from being able to get into these quote unquote sex segregated spaces, you are actually putting them in danger. Now that
you're putting them in danger from men?
It doesn't matter where the danger comes from. That's the problem.
No. See, you think the consequences meted upon others due to effects that we didn't actually create is to be solved by us.
And I would say that the sex segregated spaces wasn't created by women as a class themselves. It was created by society at large, and that's the argument that we're having, is that these societal enforced differences are things that maybe not ought to be in existence.
Maybe ought not to be is not an argument to change the architecture. Maybe
it
ought
is.
not to be is not, maybe ought not to be is a hope, it's a prayer, it's a wish on a star, and you can go ahead and wish on that star. But that does not mean that our reasons for maintaining these spaces right now can be analogized to the civil rights movement by
But it
saying it's
can be.
morally unjustifiable. No, of course not. Because the reason behind the black and white segregation was not based on anything tangible.
It was based on the belief that black people were inferior, and
It was based on,
some of these arguments that I'm hearing from online various places is that the reason that these sex segregated spaces exist is because men themselves are inherently violent as a class, as a sex. Now,
so
that I don't see how do you not see the difference here? The issue is that people believe that a certain group of people are inherently dangerous and therefore need to be controlled.
No, it says that from history we've learned that a certain group of people pose a threat to another, and therefore that there are reasons to keep the two separated.
Same arguments are made by various groups of people to keep other people down.
The fact that similar arguments can be made does not render each argument the same. The basis matters. The same
argument. In order for your argument to have primacy, you would have to prove that in inherent existence, that men are inherently dangerous to women, inherently more violent, and therefore that a person that is trying to integrate themselves into the class that is woman is therefore an inherent danger in and of themselves to the women to the women that are occupy these spaces. That you would have to say inherently so.
No, I don't. I'll tell you why. Because two things. One, the sex segregated spaces, while partially based on safety, is also partially based for convenience, comfort, privacy, and autonomy. I've already stated that. Yes. The fact that this...
I'm sorry. That's fine.
That's okay. The repeated attempts to reduce this to safety is not very accurate.
No, I'm not trying to reduce it just to safety. I'm saying that if the argument boils down to that the safety and comfort is this, and that I've already stated that I think the social's comfort surrounding these things maybe not ought to be there, and that I think that these things need to be able to fall to the wayside in order to have a better and more just and equal society. Ergo, then we should see those things disappear. If the only contention that we have is whether or not that these things are inherent to being what is and is not man or woman.
No, that's not the only contention. So, okay, I'm gonna need to say this without interruption. Okay, two things.
Sorry for interrupting.
Firstly, in order to make an argument for sex-segregated spaces, I don't need to prove that men are inherently violent, dangerous, or a threat. I mean, I could prove that, but that's a different conversation. Okay, the reasons for which we have sex-segregated spaces are for safety, privacy, autonomy, and comfort. Okay, so 4 reasons. All 4 of which have been found to be evidentially based because for multiple reasons, people in all countries and in all cultures still need these spaces in order to feel comfortable. Okay, now I'll get to it could be in a bit. First thing. Second thing, the analogy to the civil rights movement is entirely improper because the basis, just because the arguments were similar does not mean that they're the same or that they can be analogized. The problem with the civil rights comparison is that whites' discomfort was not based on anything but a belief. In our case, our discomfort is based on the fact that we are actually a heterosexual species. That in itself has massive effects on our dynamics. Secondly, on history. And thirdly, on the way our society has evolved in order to have certain conventions around, especially when people are feeling vulnerable. Okay, privacy, not just in terms of sex segregated spaces, privacy just when you're feeling vulnerable, when you want to be intimate, whatever. Mm-hmm. Humans as a species have a necessity for privacy. The white discomfort with black people was based on nothing but a belief of inferiority, which cannot be further substantiated, whereas the sexist discomfort with each other can be substantiated on several grounds. It is an unforgivable analogy. Okay, and I know it's a comforting analogy to make because then the morality of being able to exclude comes into question. But it's not, because the discomfort is based not just on historical behavior, but on the fact that we're a heterosexual species and a species that for various reasons need privacy.
I would say the only difference oh, I'm sorry, you're not done. If
No,
you're not
not
done,
yet.
continue. Sorry.
So thirdly, because this argument is completely different from the civil rights and other segregationist arguments, the moral justifiability angle is improper. It basically says that, yes, I know you have a reason to want this space, but you having this space is making someone else uncomfortable. Therefore, there's a moral cost to you now to want this space. That's not how this works, because if you want to say that, look, I understand you have a reason for the space, now there's a consequence to it, and this has to be weighed against your reasons. The consequentialism as a philosophy would then need to attribute the reason for the ill consequence on the person requesting the separation. That is not the case here.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that your last.
Okay,
if you're going to,
yeah, right. If you're going to say, well, male to female trans people are going to be in risk in male bathrooms, you having your reasons for your sex segregated spaces is excluding them. Okay, therefore it adds a moral component to your rationale for keeping sex segregated spaces. Doesn't apply because the consequence that people are suffering from is not due to the group that you're seeking to change. They were not the ones who brought about the ill consequence that you seek to repair. So you're essentially, again, asking women to pay the price for what men are doing. No. And that's why we call them, yes, because it's not as if trans men are at risk in women's bathrooms. I mean, we still may not want them there, but they are not at risk in the women's bathroom. The only reason the sex segregated spaces are even becoming an issue now is because apparently male to female trans people and gay men were also at risk from men. So the non-controversial request to have sex segregated spaces is problematic because men attack other men. And
I would say that the reason that these social spaces came into existence, as I said in the beginning of the debate, was largely a social issue and not necessarily one for safety.
Well, and for various reasons, and we have evidence to prove that, we have evidence cross-culturally and globally to prove that, it is not just about safety, it is for various reasons. Now, coming to your point, well, I don't think it should be. Maybe it won't be in 100 years, fine. But what you're trying to impose is a cost on people who have not had an input into this, into saying, well, I'd like this to be, so you go through discomfort now. On what justification? Because there's a consequence, again, not created by the people that you're putting through hell. So
wait,
how is that not
through hell? I mean, it doesn't matter. Actually, it doesn't matter.
Okay, fine. But yeah, sex segregated space. What you're saying is, look, there's going to be discomfort in social change. Okay, there's discomfort in some social changes, and it's okay that I'm putting you through this because otherwise there's one group of people who are facing consequences, a consequence of a risk because of not you, another group. So girls be uncomfortable, and boys also are uncomfortable. Girls be uncomfortable because your demand for sex segregated spaces is putting male to female trans people at risk, and it's okay that you feel uncomfortable, whether or not we're at the point where you can actually be okay with unisex bathrooms, because these people are now in danger from us. Really? I mean, and we're just supposed to roll over and be okay with that? Both sexes will have a consequence from this fallout. How boys feel about it, it is up to boys and men to decide. I'm not going to interfere in that. That's up to them. If trans men want to go in there, fine. If they feel at risk, that's a different problem. They're not at risk in the women's bathroom. They're not at risk in the women's spaces. It's only women who are getting hit. And your argument is that the discomfort that they feel, and again, actually, there are quite a few young boys who are not happy with this discomfort that they're being subjected to. because you can't come up with a different solution, and without changing, this whether or not we disagree on, is this instinctive, is this natural, is this a social thing of discomfort, we're not there yet, but people are now guinea pigs to run this experiment on.
Yeah, that's kind of just how it works, in my opinion. It's just a grand social changes cause experiments on people all the time. So
No, not all the time, and not without a good enough reason. There are
grand
always
social
other arguments.
experiments, grand social experiments,
Grand,
not minor
grand,
ones.
grand social experiments which perpetuate and which impose a large social cost on people can be morally justified because the reason for the discomfort is not morally justifiable. However, in this case, the reason for the discomfort is justifiable. Can it be changed? Maybe. Go ahead and try.
That's what's going on,
But
right? My argument is that can that be changed? Go ahead and try. That my argument is that's what's happening. People are trying
no,
to get rid of this discomfort. People are trying to push through and find what the bounds are of these new, not
that is
new, but
not done.
more socially known issues, and that is what we're experiencing right now. I would say that, like I said, that's what I believe that this is. I believe that what you are saying, go ahead and try, is what is happening, and the discomfort is a natural consequence of that happening.
When I say go ahead and try, is that you can go ahead and try to say, oh well, this discomfort is not really a natural thing, it doesn't need to exist, you can get rid of it.
Yeah,
Not that you run the experiment on people in an attempt to assess whether you can get rid of it.
but
That's what you're doing right now. No,
that's how it's done
no,
most of the time. Well,
absolutely not. No.
okay, well then I'll have to agree to disagree on this one, because
That is
I don't see this in particular impasse being rectified for either of us. So arguing it further, in my opinion, is not conducive.
it's fine, but when we talk about social change that can bring about justifiable and acceptable discomfort, that's because the roots of the discomfort can themselves be not legitimized on a philosophical or on a moral level. You can't run an experiment on people, force them through discomfort, and not just force them through discomfort. What you're doing here is one group has imposed this on the rest of society without their consent
I don't
because
see
they're on
I
it.
don't
It
see
is
one
no.
group being imposed upon by the rest of society
If that was
as a
not,
thing. I
if
know.
that
I'm
was,
saying what I mean is that it's not like this whole what's the best way to phrase this? It is not a conscious act in order to do this. Like I said, it's people trying to figure out where those bounds are. It's not like it's not being imposed on just women. It's being imposed, quote unquote, upon everybody, because that's what's going on. And like I said, I don't think it's a top down issue. I think it's a bottom up issue where you're seeing these things happen not because of Obama's Title IX changes that recognize trans people as part of a sex category of women or men, whatever, but as people figuring out, people are like, oh, you know what, I don't give a shit if somebody has a penis and they're in a women's restroom taking a leak. I only care if they actually do something with that and it hurts somebody else. Like,
that's not up to you to decide. This is again
it's
part
not
of
up
why
to
I say
anybody
this.
to decide. This is how
It is.
society is done in general. It wasn't
It
up
is
to
absolutely
it
up
wasn't
to us
it
to
wasn't up to
decide.
women to decide if whether or not that they should have the right to vote. It was up to society on a whole whether or not to decide if that was a morally acceptable thing.
Are you serious?
I agree that women should have the right to vote, and that was morally reprehensible for women to be excluded as a category from the democratic process. But if society said, "Hey, women, fuck you," and never changed, then we would be having that argument right here, right now, and it was the discomfort between these between these different people that gave rise to suffragettes and started, all these other cultural movements that ended up giving women the right to vote. Now, you can say that this is an inherently different issue because of heterosexuality, and I can concede that heterosexuality does implicate other issues on it. But however, it is society that ultimately decides whether or not something is justifiable.
No.
On a whole, not any one
society, a majority, even if now we still didn't have the right to vote, it would still be morally reprehensible. Because there was no justifiable reason.
According to us, it would be morally
according to any philosophical derivation of justifiability, you could have made that argument.
I disagree, because we wouldn't be able to have this argument that it was morally justifiable without having the differences.
The reason why that argument won 100 years ago, or whatever the time you guys got the vote, is because it could not be justified beyond a point. The inferiority could not be explained or substantiated in any basis other than
of what happened. But if the consequence was different, then we would be having this debate again. That's my point. Right now we don't know what the bounds of what is and is not morally. Well, you and I agree what can be morally justified. But as society as a whole, we don't know those bounds yet, and that's where this debate is coming into.
Okay, so firstly, the reason that debate was won is because of the lack of philosophical or moral basis of that separation.
I would say radicals would say that the reason that debate was won is because women got tired of it and started fighting men and started having sex with men and started beating people, started going to the streets, and then forced society in order to take this question. Whether or not it was a moral ought didn't come into the equation. It became a moral is because of those actions.
The fact that the suffragette movement or any social movement cannot be looked at in terms of by looking at it in one historical snapshot. Okay, part of the reason the suffragettes, and I need to finish this, the suffragettes also won because they were able to get some people to support them. How were they able to get some people to support them? Because the moral validity of the argument was stronger. And not just through brute force. I mean, brute force and the protest carried out its role, but the reason this protest grew, the reason the protest could find support was because there was a moral argument there. Now, you can say, yes, you also have a moral argument. I agree. You think you have a moral argument. I think it's wrong. But there is a moral argument to be made for whatever you're advocating. However, the fact that society did not give women the right to vote does not change whether women should have had the right to vote.
And that's what I'm saying.
Okay?
I agree with you.
And sorry, I finish. Okay?
I do apologize.
Secondly, what the boundary should be for a certain group to consider acceptable is not for the unaffected group to decide. That is ours to decide. Whether what he does with his penis, it may be okay for you, whether it's just a man with a penis in a bathroom. And apparently now they're masturbating in his bathrooms because that's a kink, whatever.
That's happening for trans, so but go on.
Not with women. The numbers are not... Anyway.
I'm sorry, I misunderstood what you were saying. Sorry.
The fact is, we get to decide what our boundary is. To say that we don't have a right to decide that and that it's up to you, society, the rest of society, to decide that is another exercise in male entitlement. And just saying that I can also you can get an opinion if our boundaries harm you, but we get to decide what our boundaries are, nobody else. That's our group boundaries.
No,
society, if for us consent means enthusiastic consent, that's our goddamn boundary. And that is okay, unless you can apply the harm principle and also say there's another harm that you don't want to, that can be avoided. So secondly, that standard is to be set by us. And thirdly, what you're essentially trying to say here is, well, I think the social change is desirable. I mean, you can, fine. And so it is okay for some of us to implement this change and force women and girls and young men and boys today, whoever is discomfort, again, not my problem, but if they are, to be a part of the social experiment. So and that is exactly why we call this misogyny, because this was because whether or not there are boys and men who are uncomfortable, the much larger cost of the erosion of sex boundaries is being borne by women and girls. The costs are still much higher for us. And what one group of society has done, who are online, who are interconnected, as you say, maybe it's not a top-down approach, but in this case, when I talk about a top-down, I talk about the light liberal process forcing it on everybody else. One group of people online, when I was saying top-down, I was saying the elite liberal classes or liberal classes forcing it on everybody else.
Gotcha. Okay.
Is to say that, okay, there are multiple costs and expenses into raising sex boundaries, but which are disproportionately felt by women and girls because of the nature of our existence. And that's okay, because some of us have decided that someone else, that we're going to run this experiment with a chance at figuring out whether this discomfort is natural or not. That's what this position amounts to.
Well, okay. I disagree that it's mostly men imposing this upon women. From my experience,
I don't think it's mostly men. Okay, I agree that it's not mostly men.
Okay, mostly
liberal classes.
Liberal classes. Okay, sure. Like liberals and conservatives have different ideas on a ton of different stuff.
Leftists.
I would say that this is becoming an acceptable liberal value, at least within in the West. I can't speak for other countries, but my experience in the West is becoming an acceptable liberal value in order to view to view trans women as women, part of the women's class. Now,
that is just okay, circle back, but okay.
I don't say I wouldn't say it's circular. I would just say that it's one of those things.
No, to circle back.
Oh, okay, sorry.
To the original point. And so the thing is here, the liberal classes have decided for the rest of society to run an experiment that has disproportionate cost for women and girls, without actually considering the consequences. On the off chance that this discomfort and all the reasons that we have sex segregated spaces can be gotten rid of.
I would say that it's not a situation.
Yeah, but you just said it is a liberal value.
I said
the consequence
yes,
of that is this. Okay, at least in the West, that is a liberal position. The consequence of that is this. We do know that the cost of this, while men and boys may experience some of it, is disproportionately on women and girls. You're not at the point, we do know that society is not at the point where the reasons for the sex segregated spaces have disappeared.
And until we go through these quote unquote experiments, we won't know where those bounds are. That's why I'm saying that we're at an impasse here, because
women and the girls of today are the guinea pigs for the experiment, and the hope
I would say everybody
that you can get rid of the reasons.
I would say everybody is the guinea pigs of this experiment, because that is how society gets structural change in these regards.
I disagree with that. It is not at all the case that in some cases structural change.
It doesn't happen 100% of the time, but if something that is this ingrained within a culture is being viewed as by a significant portion of the culture as being wrong, then that is going to cause a schism within the culture that brings us to these impasses that you and I are having right now. And I would say that is inherent to these grand ingrained cultural issues for a variety of reasons.
That has to be proven with respect to very similar cultural phenomenon, and that the best way to go about this is to impose the cost beforehand.
Can you repeat yourself?
And that the best way to go. Yeah, sorry.
No, that's okay.
In order for that argument to stand, you would need to prove that every social change, or most grand social changes in history, have required subjecting people to a social experiment with no basis, that it will succeed, and which produces disproportionate costs for one class, and that even that is morally justifiable when the decisions are being made by another class. And I'm not calling main, I'm talking about the liberal class,
I
which
understand.
need not encompass, all women and girls, or especially, or people with other reasons for wanting the sex segregated spaces. Okay, cool.
And I would say that yeah, you're partly right in that it is an experiment, but it's an experiment that happens a lot, or it
And the
happens
costs are
often enough.
justified.
And the cost, whether or not the costs are justified, has to be
Be-
taken into to extent of whether what those costs may or may not be, and we won't know until the bounds of this
We do.
are no, we don't though, because what you're what I this is me assuming your positions based on other debates that we've had, but what you would assume is that all sex-based legal protections would end up falling away because of trans women being accepted as women, and therefore women wouldn't have there wouldn't be um, there wouldn't be equal wage laws, or there wouldn't be
No, no,
I
no,
don't
no, no,
know, there
no,
wouldn't be
no, no.
okay,
That is not my position. My
okay,
position is simply this, that loss of sex
you're frozen again.
in this particular instance, in the context of this particular debate. Okay, I better now?
Yeah, you're coming in clear again.
Okay. My argument is just this. Loss of sex segregated spaces in the context of this particular debate has costs disproportionately for women and girls. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
And the trans women, accepting trans women as women, my argument on that is based on different things. Women is a sex class. If you're not of that sex class, you cannot be accepted into it. The end.
I understand your
that was it. Right. And in practice, at least in this very specific practice, the loss or the erosion of the boundaries of sex segregated spaces has already shown massive costs for women and girls. And the people that are pushing this experiment without knowing whether you can get rid of the reasons for sex segregated spaces are running this experiment with higher cost women and girls on a wish on a star that the reasons for the sex segregated spaces can be gotten rid of.
I think we would
again?
no. I was thinking and checking how long we've been live.
Yeah.
I would say that the cost probably disagree with you. I don't see any of these grand social macro level costs that you probably see. And I would also say that we won't know what more of those are until people are pulling and tugging and pulling and figuring out
There
what
are
those
girls.
are.
There are girls. There are girls in the UK who have dropped out of school because of unisex bathrooms. Is that a cost, or is that does that not count?
Why did they drop out because of unisex bathroom? That's the thing.
But they have. That's happened. That has happened
Sure,
in the UK, not in the developing world.
I will assume that what you are saying is correct for the sake of argument. I don't have any reason to disbelieve you because people do these things. But a individual consequence of this happening doesn't mean that is the cause of
They
this
dropped out
going
because
on.
of unisex. They
They
dropped
might have
out because of
they
the
could have
unisex
dropped out
bathrooms.
because of unisex bathrooms, but those unisex bathrooms existing isn't necessarily an ought. Like the thing is that just because somebody does something doesn't mean that the reason that this thing is being done is not morally justifiable. You have to.
I'm just saying that. I'm just saying.
How many women? How many girls are doing this? If it's like hundreds of thousands of girls, then okay, we have a huge issue and we have to readdress this.
So
if
the
it's like
girls
10,
dropping
who
out.
cares?
So the girls dropping out in the UK because they've lost their sex segregated spaces is okay.
I would
in
say
the UK, not in the developing world.
Yeah, I would say
in several schools.
I would say that it is a tragedy, but it is not necessarily a consequence of unisex bathrooms in of themselves. But
they've literally stated that. We know that
it is not an inherent cause of their dropping out. The culture. I would say that the cultural implications and the cultural things that I believe ought not to be are the reasons.
But you haven't changed the culture yet.
Exactly.
You haven't changed the culture yet. You changed the architecture, and then you're saying it's not a consequence.
We are back to the point of saying that this is in a transitional period of where discomfort is going to happen, and there's going to be consequences that neither side are going to like while we figure out what is and is what should or should not be. This is an impasse that I don't think that we're going to ever get past, because I would say that these girls dropping out is a tragedy and should not have happened, but it does not. It is, and it's a consequence of.
But it's okay.
I would, in order for us to verify whether or not it is okay, it has to be determined whether or not what we are doing right now is itself okay.
I'm not talking about. You're expanding it to whether
but that's where I'm coming from.
Just the unisex bathrooms.
That's where I'm coming from, though.
It can't matter just where you come from if this is the immediate implementation of your policy. Your policy is to try. Yes, no, it's not. You can't do that. Your policy is to say we're running the experiment. Fine. The experiment involves unisex bathrooms. Fine. We know that girls in the UK. So your thing is that you're trying out an experiment and in a transition period or whatever, and that you think the moral justification of the potential benefits of this experiment have to first be assessed in order to know whether girls dropped out because of unisex bathrooms. Those are two very different things.
No, it's not whether or not it's not whether or not they dropped out because of the unisex bathroom thing. The issue, the difference is that we don't know whether unisex bathrooms in and of themselves will cause women to feel in and of themselves uncomfortable.
But they did. We know that it did.
No, we don't know that. We know that there's all these social, cultural hang-ups that surround gender and sex that cause these things. And when we're talking about grand social change and social evolution, we have to look at different points of history where similar things, not perfectly similar things, but similar things happened where it caused discomfort. And then once they fell to the wayside, people are like, oh, you know what? This isn't so bad. That's why we have to do this.
You keep switching from saying that, if they dropped out because of unisex bathrooms right now, we have to take into account the social and cultural milieu around it.
We do have to take that into account.
That is the state of existence right now. No.
But we also have to take into
account. That is the state of existence right now. This is when you're running the experiment.
Yes.
You said, you're saying it's a transition period, so we have to run the experiment. This is the social and cultural milieu right now. Running the experiment, and that's the cost, and you're saying that that's okay.
Yes, I am very much saying that is okay on a macro level.
That is okay.
It is a tragedy.
The girls and women suffer right now because of loss of segregated spaces.
Macro
the women being raped in prisons is okay.
No. See, that's the thing. Okay,
part of the transition.
No.
Okay, we'll get to that. Fine. Let's start that last part.
What I'm saying. This is. I am looking at it from a very grand macro perspective where you have to look at all of society. And you are looking at it from a more micro perspective of how it only affects women and girls. And, maybe in particular, women and girls that are feeling uncomfortable and end up dropping out.
Women and girls.
Okay. Women and girls. Like I said, that's your perspective. My perspective is society as the whole, and whether or not something is or should not be, and whether or not something that is happening is necessarily morally justified for the grand social look of it, the society as a whole. I am not looking at just
you can look at it. You can look at it from wherever you want. That's fine. You can implement this policy. But from where you're looking at, you've implemented this policy, you've changed these architectures, you've agreed that this is the social and cultural milieu right now. And for that, the consequences on women and girls are okay because it's an experiment you're running. And this is the transition period in which costs have to be felt. So the cost being experienced by them is okay because there's no other conclusion
on a macro level,
irrespective of how macro you get out.
On a
irrespective
macro level,
of how macro you go out of it.
It's not irrespective though, because the girls dropping out.
No, it is because
no,
because the macro doesn't change what's happening at the micro level. The
that's what
macro
I was
perspective
getting to
isn't
that.
going to change what happens at the micro level.
I was getting to that. The micro level, it being okay on the micro level doesn't necessarily translate it to it not being okay on the micro level doesn't necessarily translate it to being it not being okay on the macro level. The one doesn't have a direct line. There's not from point A to point B. There's not an inherent thing there.
It does.
But it doesn't. That's the thing, because
there is an inherent thing there, because the macro perspective.
Let's do a small thought experiment here. All right. Let's make it as ridiculous as possible. All right. There is a society of people that believe that unless you have a balloon tied to your wrist, then you're going to hell or something. Well, it's something stupid, ridiculous, right? And there's a group of people like, no, I demand not to have these balloons tied to my wrist. So I am not going to do this anymore. And those people are then segregated off from society because it has consequences or whatever, and what happens to those people is a tragedy. But having a balloon tied to your wrist is not inherently immoral position, and in fact imposing the balloons tied to your wrist can be an inherent immoral position, because you are forcing other people to do something against their will, right? So when that is severed, then you look at it and people are like, oh, look, this isn't so bad. What the fuck were we doing all these years?
Okay, but that thought experiment doesn't change the situation here. Is that no matter how macro you withdraw from, no matter how much of a macro perspective you have, no matter how much you try to look at it from a society-wide lens, in your opinion, this cost, in order to go through the transition period without any reason to believe on whether this would succeed or not, whether you can actually get rid of these reasons for segregation or not, is an acceptable cost on women and girls. It's an acceptable cost to society, not just women and girls. It's an acceptable cost on women and girls, because they're the ones paying the cost. As well. Because hold on, let me say why. If a young girl drops out of school and then becomes a ward of the state, that implies, not necessarily entirely a ward of the state, but let's say that a person that doesn't graduate from high school is more likely to be a criminal or some other form of social outcast. But those social outcasts have social costs, and those social costs directly negatively impact me, as well as you and everybody else. Because society has traditionally given a damn about what happens to women and girls. That is our history. Because society has traditionally given a damn about the consequences of women and girls. That doesn't matter to this argument. No, of course it does. Because it really doesn't. This argument is about what ought to be. Society has always, when someone experiences the cost and the consequences of those costs, if she's going to become an unemployed ward of the state or something, it depends on who's consuming or absorbing those costs at the end. Okay, but the first cost is not necessarily. It really depends. No, it doesn't. No, I would say everybody. It's the same thing for racism. Racism directly negatively impacts. You cannot just say, I would say it's everybody, because in real life, a person who drops out of school does not affect everybody in the same way. It affects a certain class of people. It affects a certain class of people, and the costs are absorbed at different points in society, mostly by the person who has been abandoned, okay? But not necessarily by all of society. And you can't just say, well, in my opinion, that's just... No, it does. Okay, so when I am saying it's borne by everybody, I am not saying it is borne by everybody equally. Obviously, the person that gets, drafted to a ward is not... They're just a collateral abstract... Say again? It's okay, sorry, go ahead. But I'm just saying, and I have to wrap this up in 2 minutes. Yeah, that's fine. I was gonna say that we can be. You can have the last word. We can be done after I'm finished. It's fine to me. We've been on for like 2.5 hours, so I would say that this is another example, and you're going to say this is morally reprehensible to make it. Racism negatively impacts everybody, and it negatively impacts Black people more than white people. However, white people are affected by racism as well, because when racism is a cultural thing that prevents Black people from rising to their own individual potential as people, that takes away their talents from being naturally accessed through whatever methods or means
to other people, which negatively impacts everybody in the long run. I'm not saying that it's a thing that where, white people are obviously the most affected by racism. That's obviously not true, but white people are also negatively affected by it. So potentially the preventing trans women from being seen as a part of the woman class has potentially the same consequences. I'm not saying that it does. We don't know that yet. And I am saying that because we don't know that yet, we can't say whether or not that individual people that are choosing as individuals to drop out of school or whatever, choosing to drop out of schools or whatever, is a unmorally justifiable cost. It is a cost. It is a cost borne by the individual and if you want to extrapolate from the individual because it's happening to multiple people, then we can say women as a class, but we can't say whether or not that is not morally justifiable in the long run because we don't know yet.
With respect to your last analogy, at an abstract level, it may or may not be true that racism just affects white people, but if they were in fact absorbing the cost, it's very easy to theorize that it technically they have talents that you don't exactly benefit from. But most of history has proven that racism does in fact benefit the upper class
it benefits
enough sufficiently for them to feel okay with it. So even today, with the riots going on, white people are not going to be affected, not even to the same degree. Whatever costs that they are bearing at an abstract level is not ever going to be enough to actually harm them because they're going to find ways around it. And in the same way, the cost being imposed currently on women and girls by a liberal class that's running an experiment on the basis of a hope and a wish and a prayer that these reasons can be eliminated is going to be primarily borne by them. Okay, and maybe at a very abstract, indirect, 5 times removed from them, there will be a cost to a tax system somewhere, and for you, that may be considered morally justifiable I mean, that's what we have to be clear about, is that this experiment is being run by people for whom these costs and women and girls are a justifiable collateral damage. Because I mean, of course, you may say that at a macro level, it's morally justifiable because maybe in 200 years, we'll get to a point where these reasons disappear.
I wouldn't say.
But these costs are being these costs are being experienced by one group right now, and
that's usually how it happens.
Yeah, it's usually how it's not true, but okay, I think we have to let it go at that.
And what I would also say is that we do not know whether the benefits of removing these barriers to this would lead to betterment of women as a class as well. We don't know yet. But you don't know that. See, that is an assumption because you don't know
absolutely don't
consequences.
Because they don't need those. They absolutely don't need those. Women and girls do not benefit at all from the removal of these boundaries.
We can abstract it more, but I don't think we're going to agree. So, and you said you had to leave in 20 minutes anyways. So,
yeah, I have to leave.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, send me the recording.
All right. Well, everybody.
Okay.
Thanks, Linda. I know you have to go.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining me.
See you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
All right, everybody. So Linda has had to leave. So I think this was a decent debate. If you do not think this was a decent debate or not, or you have comments, concerns, bitches, gripes, whatever, or critiques, please let me know. I am trying to do this on a more regular basis. So if you didn't like the format, or if you thought my positions were not well articulated or anything like that, please let me know. As you can see, display here is Crowdsourced Politics. Crowdsourced Politics is a debate group and that I help run that gave birth to a podcast with the same name. You can find the podcast on all your streaming services, but we like Spotify because Spotify gets propagated earlier than the other streaming services. So if you think you liked what you kind of heard here and like to learn a little bit more about me and the group, go ahead and check us out on crowdsourcepolitics.org. So we have our own URL where you can get your podcast, and it is called Crowdsourced Politics with an S.org. And you can also catch us on the first and third Sunday of every month right now. That might change in the future for news roundups for 2 weeks of news roundups, our thoughts and opinions as the group. So thanks, guys. This was great.